let's get it going. I am going to go over the class 1 first exercise. And so as I write at the top in italics here, I'm going to go through each of these, how to do each of these things. It's going to be loading in data, getting familiar with SPSS, doing these sorts of things. I'm going to do it with a data set called hamsters. Shout out to hamsters. And then your task for your exercise before class meets is to do the same thing but with a different data set. I've included a data set in a data folder in Google Drive called mtcar small. I recommend that's the one you use because it's very small and it allows you to see exactly what's happening because it's so small. But if you have a different data set that you'd like to do this with, feel free. It'd be kind of a way to get analyzing that. If it's longer, it just becomes a little bit harder to learn because you can't see everything that's going on. And so over in this window, I have the portal loaded up. So the first thing I'm going to do is get into SPSS. And it'll take a second to load because we're using the online portal, so it's going back and forth. And then I always get rid of this pop-up, always comes up. I always get rid of this first. And I'm going to put this, well, let's start with this over on the right-hand side of the screen. And I'm going to suggest that the first thing you do is, this isn't mandatory, but go into Edit and Options, and then make sure that this notification raise viewer window is unselected. That's going to prevent it from popping up and changing where your windows are all the time. And I think that ends up being a hassle. I'll show you kind of my workflow, and it does not include that being checked. So make sure that's unchecked. Hit OK. It's popping up with like what you've done. You can just X out of that for now. We'll say no. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an SPSS directory. And that's really just a directory is where we're going to store our files, where we're going to store our code. So I'm going to create a folder. I'm going to call it SPSS_directory. This will be where we keep our files and things. Now, I'm going to have you upload your solutions after you're done, but over the quarter, things saved on your virtual server will stay there. At the end of the quarter, it'll get wiped clean for the next class period. And so then what I'm going to do is I need to download this data. So I'm going to download hamsters. And looks like I've already downloaded it, so I'll drag it here. I'm going to put it into my directory. So you'll do that probably with mtcars. And now that I have that, I can make this full screen. And now our task is we create an SPSS directory, we downloaded data, and now we're going to load the data into SPSS. And so in order to do that, I'm just going to go to File and then Import Data. And the file type that I have is CSV. So it's just sort of CSV stands for a comma separated value. If I click there and then I click on the file, it already knew to look in the SPSS directory. You might have to navigate to that by clicking around, but you'll find the file, click Open. It's going to give you a bunch of different options for importing it. Does the first line contain variable names? Turns out it does, yes. Usually the defaults are pretty good. So what I'll usually do is I'll just hit OK and see if things work. And you kind of get this moment of, whoa. And it looks like things work. It looks like the data loaded in fine. Sometimes things will look funny. And now in order to just be able to see everything, I'm going to move that over to the left. And then what keeps popping up is an output file. And so this is going to be where what we do is recorded by SPSS. This is one of the great advantages over something like Microsoft Excel, where you can click around a bunch and not be able to repeat or see what you've done. There's ways around that in Excel, but it's a little bit complicated. Output, this keeps track, and basically this describes the code that the computer ran in order to load this data, but we don't need to worry about that just yet. So next thing, we're on to B, the basics of analysis. Find descriptives of one variable at a time. And so descriptives is just very basic statistics. What's the mean? What's the sum maybe? How many variables are there? Etc. And so I'm going to go to Analyze. Going to Descriptive Statistics, there's two options. There's frequencies and then descriptives. Descriptives is a little better. It gives you more options. But you're going to notice one downside. Only my columns hamsters and hamster cages are showing up. And the reason is because those are the only ones with numbers. Those are the only ones that we can calculate a standard deviation on, a mean on, etc. Name and gender are characters or strings or words, and it becomes a little bit more difficult. So to look at that, you'd have to look at the frequency. I should also introduce this data set. I made it up. I'm excited about it. We've got 7 names of, we'll call them students. We've got their gender. We've got how many hamsters they own, and then the number of hamster cages that they have in order to house those hamsters. So I can pick one of these variables. I could even pick both, but we'll keep it simple, just do one. And if I hit OK, it's going to give me descriptives, but I want to check out options. I want to check out what it's going to give me. Notice, yeah, I'm interested in the mean. I'd like to know the standard deviation. Min, max is great. Display order and variable list, fine. Sum. I want to know the sum. I want to know total how many hamsters these 7 students have. So I'm going to check that because I'm curious about that. I want to know about these hamsters. And so I click there, variables, hamsters. I'm going to click OK. And you're going to notice like, whoa, what happened? Well, the action's over here in our output document. And so what this did was it generated another section in our output document. You can click around here in order to navigate it. And it created a descriptive section because I calculated some descriptives. And so descriptives of dataset 1, that's the dataset I loaded in. And then this is what we generated. This is what we generated. We looked at the variable hamsters. N was 7, which means there was 7 rows. That's true. The min, the fewest number of hamsters, was 1. The maximum, 7, is the maximum number of hamsters. The sum is 26. There's the answer to the question that I was really, really curious about. There are 26 total hamsters between these 7 students. And that makes a mean of 3.71 and a standard deviation of 2.89. And so I just looked quickly at the hamsters variable. Now let's say I want to look at one of the gender variable, for example. I've got to go to frequencies instead to analyze the frequencies. And so for example, I can do gender, and if I click OK, it's going to give me the frequencies. Frequencies is like a fancy word for count. And so here I have gender. There's 3 females. That's 42.9%. There's 4 males. That's 57.1% of the 7. And so that's how you do basic descriptive work. Now, the next step, B2, so we're going to create a new variable. And the task you're going to notice in SPSS is really to find where what you want to do is up here. That's a little bit daunting at first, but as you get in a sense of how IBM decide to organize these, it becomes easier. So transform, that kind of sounds like creation of a new variable. Transform, I'll create something, I'll move it around, I'll transform it. And lo and behold, compute variable will do what we want. So I can click compute variable. And the first thing it's going to want is, what's the name of this new variable? What's the name? Crack the knuckles. What's the name? So I'm going to do hamsters per cage. Here, we're going to figure out how many hamsters are in each cage for each student. So in order to do that, I'm going to I grab my variables from down here and I send them over to my expression. Take the number of hamsters, and I'm going to divide by the number of hamster cages. And that'll create a new variable. Now you're going to notice there's all of these kind of fancy little greater than or less than or equal to's, and you can play around with that. But I'm just doing something basic where I'm dividing. And there's also fancy functions over here. Each of these is a function group, and then I can choose from there. So, for example, if I went to the top arithmetic, I can find the absolute value of something if I click there. And so it would, when I double click it, it puts it up there. But I don't want that. I just want hamsters divided by hamster cages. I'm going to click OK. I produced a log here, which gives me the code that it ran. But the action actually happened in the dataset window here. It created this new variable, and it's exactly what I wanted. I'm excited about. Measurement tool. 5 hamsters, 2 cages. There must be 2.5 hamsters per cage. Hopefully it's 3 and 2 or 4 and 1 or something, but on average, there's 2.5 hamsters per cage for Megan, who is a female. And that's how you create variables. I can create another variable. Let's do something else. Let's just check if gender equals male. Oh no, I forgot to update. So I want a new variable, gender male, And what's weird is, gotta stop and look at this. 0 for female and 1 for male. That's how it codes true and false. True is coded as 1, false is coded as 0. So anytime it was a male, it put a 1 there. Now, our next step, I've done B1 and B2. Our next step is to delete a variable. And a good candidate to be deleted is this gender male, because it doesn't really tell me anything. And so I want to keep my data set kind of as simple as possible without losing information. Deleting a variable is actually pretty easy. I'm just going to right click on the variable that I'm looking at. I will click clear, and there, it's gone. Side note, you can go to variable view and you can see the variables that you're working with, and they describe different things. But data view, variable's gone. Next thing is I'm going to sort by a variable. Maybe, just maybe, I want to sort, I want to figure out who has the fewest hamsters per cage, who has the most hamsters per cage, and I want to sort by that. In order to do that, I'm going to go to data, manipulating the data around, and then I want to sort cases. Now, what's the word cases mean? Case refers to the row. So Megan is a case, Amy's a case, Jen's a case. So row is like an observation or a case. We click sort cases. I can choose what I want to sort by. Do hamsters per cage. And ascending is going to go from least to most. So instead, I want to do descending. I'm curious about who is the most. Who's the most hamsters all locked up in one cage? I want to go talk to them, go maybe suggest some better hamster practices. I can put another one in here, which is going to say, if there's a tie on this first one, sort by the second one. And so let's do that. Exactly what happened. The data is sorted. There's still 7 rows, but now they're in a different order. Hamsters per cage is first. And so I go 7, 3, 2.5, 2, 2, 1.2. And then when I had this tie, 2 and 2, the tie, I forget if I did hamsters or hamster cages, but the tie went to the tie was broken by the second variable that I had put in there. And so now I'm sorted. Sort by a variable. Now let's filter out rows. Let's say I'm only interested in looking at female. I'm really interested in female student hamster practices. So I want to just filter out rows. And so our task is to kind of look at data. I think will include filter. So I'm not transforming or creating anything. I'm not analyzing really. I'm kind of doing something with my data. And I'm going to select cases. So it's select rows. Filter out rows would be like get rid of. I'm going to select cases. What am I going to do? I'm going to say, I don't want to select all the cases. I want to select certain cases. And I want to select cases if it's going to be based on gender. And if gender equals, and then because I've got to put this in quotation marks, if gender equals female, those are the cases I want. Now, we need to be careful here. This output box is very, very important. You might be tempted to delete selected cases, but then they're literally going to be deleted from your data set, and you could not even go back and look at males if you wanted to. That's a dangerous practice, because what if you do decide you're interested in male hamster practices? So instead, I'm just going to filter out. You're going to see what happens when I do that. If I click filter out, I get slashes on the ones that got filtered out. And so 2, 5, 6, and 7 are kind of now invisible to SPSS in some sense. If I do something now, it's not going to pay attention to 2, 5, 6, and 7. They're filtered out. I can still see that they're there, but what SPSS is now going to listen to is 1, 3, and 4. And so to illustrate this, let's go back and do the very first thing that we did, which was just descriptive statistics. Let's look at descriptives. Let's run it for hamsters again. Let's just run this exact same code. I'd done it before. Now, it produced this thing at the bottom of the output file. And you're going to notice, before it was 7, if I look at the first time I ran descriptives, if I go up here, there was 7. That's because I did it for all the rows. But now the last time I ran descriptives, it's 3. and the minimum is 5, and the maximum is 7. And why is that? Because we filtered out males, and it's only looking at the females. So now when I looked at descriptives, it said, okay, those males are kind of invisible to me. I'm only going to look at the females. And so that's how I filtered out rows, and then I did something with it. So I just did C1, find descriptives of a variable with rows filtered out. Let's say I don't want to filter out males anymore, but I want to analyze the data where I'm analyzing for females, and then I'm analyzing for males, and it's kind of a separate practice. And so in order to do that, I want to get my males back. If I go select cases, let's say, come on back, males. All cases. Everyone, all genders invited. All cases. So I've got filter off. That's what just did. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do what's called splitting. And so I'm going to split the file. And what does split the file mean? It means SPSS is now going to think about this data set as separate data sets, and it's going to analyze it in that way. I think it'll take you to see it in order to understand what I mean. I'm going to go to compare groups, and I'm going to bring gender in here. And so SPSS is going to create groups based on gender, and then it'll listen to those groups when I analyze the data. So if I click OK, it makes groups. 1 through 3 is one group based on gender. 4 through 7 is another group based on gender, female versus male. And now let's look at what's going to happen if I do analyze. Let's say I do descriptives on, let's look at descriptives on hamsters per cage. So if I click OK, now these descriptives, you're going to notice that the first column is the gender. And so it's going to do exactly what I just told it to do, but it's going to do it for each gender. It's the file's been split, the data set's been split behind the scenes. And so I have female, I have male, and it shows me that there's 3 females, 4 males. The minimum hamsters per cage for females is 2, the maximum is 7. We have means and standard deviations. Looks like for females, looks like in this data set, male hamster practices look to be a little bit better. Well, I don't know too much about hamsters, but they're keeping fewer hamsters in a cage. I would be worried about overcrowding of hamsters. It could be the case. One might argue that you want actually more hamsters in a cage. Maybe there's a social feel to it. I don't know. Maybe I need to research hamsters. But so it's done it based on the split. And so if I do data split file, I've got these groups I can always see. I'm going to click reset because let's say I'm done with the groups. I don't want those anymore. And so find descriptives of a variable after splitting the data set. I just did C2. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do D1 and D2. Look at syntax for a command we already learned. So you're going to notice that when I've been doing things in the output file, it shows us the actual output. It shows us the results and it tells us information. It's also throwing in this code in between. And I said, this is the code that's being used. Well, a lot of data scientists, folks working with data, like to just use the code instead of the point and click because they find it faster to type and because it's easier to modify. And so I'm going to show you how to do that now. So let's again let's try something new. Let's do a correlate. Let's do a bivariate correlation. Let's see if there's any correlation between hamsters and hamster cages. I've got different options here. Now, what we've been clicking is OK. And OK sends it over to the output tab. I have my data tab, my output tab. But instead, I'm going to click paste. And instead of actually running the command, what it's done is it's pulled up the third tab of SPSS. SPSS has 3 tabs. Data, where I keep my data. Output, where I look at my output. And syntax, where I can use code. And so in order to do this, you can play around with how to do this. But if I highlight that and hit run, it's going to run that correlation. And so we're going to notice that looks like there's a negative 0.334 correlation between the number of hamsters and the number of hamster cages for a student. And so that's how I ran it using this. What's great about this is now, let's say I want to do something similar. I can copy and paste that code, but let's say, no, I'm not interested in hamsters and hamster cages. I'm interested in hamsters and hamsters per cage. And so I can kind of look at this variable, and I can kind of look at this code and backwards out what's happening. Dataset 1 is the name of the data set that we're happening. We're running the correlations command. That's what I found when I went up there. And then the variables, and there was some options that we selected, and they're specified here. And so now if I go here and I click run, how does run work? Oh, it looks like run. So I think I've got to highlight it. I'm not used to that. But if I highlight the code that I want to run and I click run, I now get the correlation for something else. And people love to use these syntax files because they're easy to manipulate. If I get fluent with the code, I can start to type very quickly as opposed to having to point and click. It keeps a very clear log of everything that I've done. And so, but still, it's basically the difference from going from highlighting and running code versus pointing and clicking and then seeing the code run as a result of the point and the click. And you can go back and forth between the two. You can do both. That's actually one of the great advantages of SPSS, that it has both options. But we'll be using syntax more and more in the future because that's the way that once you get really sophisticated, that's the way people tend to prefer to use it. And so we just looked at the syntax for a command we already learned. We play around with syntax from the other command. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save all of these files. And so remember, I've got a data set, I've got an output file, and I've got a syntax. First, we're going to click on the data, and I'm going to just save as, and it'll keep it up. And I'm going to save it as, I'll save it as hamsters. So I'll click save. If I click on the output, I'm going to click file, save as. I'm going to call this hamsters. For some reason, this isn't registering that I want it to go into my desktop. It's not registered. I want to go into my SPSS directory, so I'm going to. So I save that. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find that syntax editor, and I'm going to save that. And I'll call this hamsters. And so if I click save there. And so now let's look at what's happened. I can X out of all of these things because I feel like I've got them saved. Now if I click on SPSS directory, I have all of these different files, and I can see what they are in the type. So I've got the data document. If I double click on that, it's going to take a second, but the data document will load. I've got the output file, this output file. So if I double click on that, the output file will load. And then I've got the syntax file. So if I double click on that, the syntax file will load. And so I basically saved those three things. Your assignment is to turn those in and upload those to Canvas. And that's the last thing to do here. So again, I did that with hamsters. Your task, we don't want to save. Your task is to do it with a different data set. You can do it with empty cars, which is in the data folder. Fun little data set based on the miles per gallon of a few different cars. Maybe not as fun as hamsters, but it's hard to beat hamsters. Or you can do it with something else. If you've got some interesting data, if you feel like, oh, I understand this well enough to start analyzing some data from research or something that I'm doing, feel free to do it that way. Okay, that's class 1, getting started, descriptives. Hope that was useful.